Hello, everyone. My name is Cassandra Emmons. I'm the Global Democracy Data Advisor in the Center for Applied Research and Learning. I'm very excited to get us started on our panel, introducing new delimitation standards. Many of you in the audience have been involved in the extraordinary task of drawing or redrawing electoral district boundaries. And this exercise, which of course takes place well before Election Day, has extreme consequences for the election outcome. Holding people's votes constant, different sets of boundaries will produce different election results and ultimately different government. There are many choices thus to be made during the delimitation process and sometimes competing considerations to bear in mind. Understanding these stakes, what principles can best guide those choices to pursue fair representative maps? And what kinds of data do you, as officials in this capacity, need in order to approach this in an inclusive way? Today, we're very pleased to have an esteemed group of individuals to discuss these very issues. So first, joining us online is Professor Nicholas Stephanopoulos. He's the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He's the author of Aligning Election Law and the co-author of Election Law Cases and Materials, so a lot of experience and expertise to draw on for us. He's also been involved in several litigation efforts, including 2 partisan gerrymandering cases based on his scholarship that were ultimately decided by the Supreme Court of the United States. He continues to work on litigation and advocacy as the Director of Strategy of Harvard Law School's Election Law Clinic, and he's the co-founder of PlanScore, which is a web-based tool for assessing past, present, and potential election district plans in the United States, which fortunately we'll get to take a look at together today. Also joining us online is Professor Christopher Warshaw. He's Professor of Political Science at George Washington University. He's published at length on the issue of gerrymandering and representation in major academic and popular journals. And he has also served as an expert witness on a dozen partisan gerrymandering cases at the congressional and state levels. So we're very happy to have both of them joining us virtually. And then on stage with me today, I have Dr. Micah Altman, who is the social and information scientist at MIT's Center for Research in Equitable and Open Scholarship. He's the author of over 100 pieces on these kinds of issues across the spectrum of books and journal articles. And his most recent research is focused on, among other things, establishing requirements for reliable information and anonymization and privacy of that information, as well as the role of public participation and institutional design in redistricting processes. So we're very excited to hear from all 3 of our panelists today. Professor Warshaw, Chris, I'll turn to you first, and so we'll get him on the large screen. Oh, he's right behind me, great. So Chris, can you please tell us a bit about the main considerations and challenges for drawing electoral maps? What makes a map more or less fair, and can you provide us with some examples from the US?
Great. Well, I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. Sorry I have to be on a big screen behind you rather than being there in person. So I'm going to talk about, just introduce some of the rules for districting and how do we evaluate fair maps. So we should have a slide in front of you now that says rules for redistricting. And so in the United States, like in many but not all countries, all of our congressional districts are drawn with a single member. So we don't have multi-member congressional districts or party list voting or proportional representation or any number of other electoral systems that you could have. And most of our state legislative districts are also elected in single-member districts, where just one elected official emerges from each district. So as a result, the legislative lines are really important for determining who's going to win or lose elections. There's, I think, as all of you know, there are few more important, I think, institutional aspects to how elections are run than exactly what does the constituency look like that people run in. For the House of Representatives, our Constitution says that we have to reapportion the boundaries every decade. Well, actually not the boundaries. We reapportion the number of representatives in each state every decade based on the census. And until the 1960s, there were few explicit rules on exactly how often districts had to be redrawn. So you had rampant malapportionment for most of America's history, where some legislative districts or congressional districts would be many times the size of other districts. And it was only in the 1960s that we established an explicit standard for one person, one vote, where each congressional district has to be exactly the same population, and each state legislative district has to be nearly the same population. So if we go to my next slide on malapportionment, what this shows is the percentage of people that it took to elect the majority of a legislature in the mid-20th century. And you can see that in many states, you could elect a majority of the legislature with far fewer than a majority of the public. Because the districts were so malapportioned, you had some districts that had as many as 100 times more or less population than other districts. And it was only in the 1960s when the Supreme Court really set down one person, one vote that we moved to equal populace districts. And I think, today in the United States, we continue to have, vigorous debates about how to evaluate the fairness of different districting plans and different values we hold for drawing maps. But I think the reapportionment revolution in the 1960s is a huge normative and success of our modern system that I think is at least given us the foundation to have fair maps. So then moving into the more specific rules that I'm going to introduce you to, and then our other panelists are going to talk more about. So if we have my slide now that has a variety of more specific rules in front of you, after the constitutional requirement that the Supreme Court has set down of one person, one vote, there's a number of state-specific rules. We actually don't have very many other federal rules. But different states have sort of specific traditional redistricting criteria, which includes things like, you have to have, in almost all states, you have to have contiguous districts. So you can't have a district that's sort of split by, it's in one part of the district's in one part of the state, and the other part of the district's like across the state. The districts have to be compact. In many states, they have to represent communities of interest, which is a little bit amorphous. But usually means, if there's like a big farming constituency, maybe they have to be in the same district. If there's a big, manufacturing plant, maybe you shouldn't have the district go right through the middle of the manufacturing plant. Things like that. You want to keep a community of people together to the extent we can. And then Professor Altman later is going to talk more about many states require transparency in their redistricting processes. And, this is a little bit squishy. And it's going to vary a lot state by state, but I think that scholars agree that the more transparent a redistricting process, the better it's likely to meet our normative standards. Beyond these state-specific rules, Congress has passed something called the Voting Rights Act, which has then been renewed by Congress a number of times. And the Voting Rights Act sets forth a number of other standards, in particular on how we can draw districts that try to improve representation for racial minorities. But crucially, the federal government has no explicit standards for the partisan fairness of districts. And in United States, in American politics in the modern day, partisan politics kind of dominates everything else. And so there's no federal requirement that maps have to, give both parties equal treatment. So what we found is that when politicians draw the districts, they tend to draw maps that are heavily skewed in favor of their party. And that's been true across American history, but it's even more true today as mapping technology has increased, so they have more ability to sort of skew the maps, and their incentives have increased. Some states have moved to nonpartisan districts, and those have generally produced more fair maps, and I'll show you one in a second. Turning quickly to just on my last slide on how we can think about measuring partisan fairness. There's two broad benchmarks that political scientists and other social scientists have used. One is evaluating a neutral map, roughly speaking, based on whether it treats both parties symmetrically. And if you get about 50% of the vote, you should get about 50% of the seats. And there's a number of different, more detailed metrics that sort of go into the surface of that more. But that's sort of the basic idea. A map should treat both parties equally, and if you get half the votes, you should get half the seats. If you get more than half the votes, then you probably should get a little more than half the seats. But the other standard that more recently has been established, and people think about a lot now, is that in many places, it's actually very difficult to draw a map that each party could win the same number of seats on if they get half the votes. Because increasingly, Republicans are concentrated in rural areas, Democrats, which is the liberal party in the United States, are concentrated in urban areas, and in many states, it's essentially impossible to draw a map that each party could win the same number of seats on if they get half the votes. And in particular, in like a very democratic place like Massachusetts, where Professor Stephanopoulos and Professor Altman live, essentially it's almost impossible to draw a map where Republicans win a district, and it's impossible to draw a map that Republicans win more than one district, or nearly impossible. And there's different geographic biases in other maps, so increasingly we turn to nonpartisan simulation tools that try to evaluate how many districts would we be likely to see on a sort of map that didn't take into account politics, but did take into account the political geography of a state. So I want to show you real quick a website that we mentioned earlier that Professor Stephanopoulos and I built along with a number of other social scientists. So this is called PlanScore. And PlanScore takes the first approach I described, where it basically looks at whether a map is treating both parties the same. And it has a number of sort of detailed social science metrics where you can both look at the historical fairness of different plans. So we can say that the current Republican or the current state house plan in Pennsylvania actually is very fair for the two parties. Previous plans skewed more pro-Republican, and you can compare the different metrics that social scientists have developed. And I'm happy to talk more of those later if we have time during question and answer. The other thing you can do on PlanScore that's pretty cool is until recently, it was very hard to evaluate a plan kind of in real time. So what would happen is politicians would draw a redistricting plan kind of behind closed doors, and it was very hard to figure out how fair it was or whether it was skewed in favor of one party or another. So in the past decade, there's been a number of sort of computational tools. PlanScore is one of those, but there's a number of others that enable members of the public or journalists or activists or politicians to very quickly upload a plan and see how fair it is. So this is the Michigan Congressional plan that was actually passed by a nonpartisan commission there, and it's extremely fair. It treats both parties roughly equally based on a variety of different metrics. It has a small pro-Republican bias, but compared to previous plans in Michigan, it's much more fair than previous plans. And as a result, Democrats and Republicans have won about the same number of congressional seats in Michigan in recent elections. So I'll stop there and turn it over to our other panelists.
Thank you so much. And everyone will be able to access PlanScore. It's online, so you could explore a little bit more and learn more about the variety across the states. Dr. Altman, turning to you, seeing these plans, what kinds of data do officials need to have on hand to approach redistricting exercises in an inclusive way? And what really makes those processes inclusive from your perspective?
Well, let's start up some slides on that. I'm trying to get to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Just a standard disclaimer. What I say here is my own opinion, not anybody else's. But if I say anything that makes sense, it's probably because of all my collaborators, and so there's a lot of work that you can look at. The data for boundary delimitation across the world, for redistricting in the US, there are a number of categories that are required. First of all, we need demographic characteristics of individuals. I mean, one of the key properties, as Professor Warshaw talked about, is I don't know where the slide went. There we go. Thanks. equal population. That's a foundational requirement for districting. And so you need to know where people are. And if your criteria for fairness has to do with how people behave, if there are divisions among people in a partisan way or in other sort of communities of interest, the demographic information needs to be there to be able to understand the impact of those lines across different demographic criteria that are important for representational characteristics. Secondarily, we need geographic features and boundaries. I think I will pop this up so that I can actually see my slides here. All districting is done across existing geographies. We don't move people from, individuals from one place to another, redistrict down one side of people's bedrooms, but through fixed geographic units, usually defined by a census, and align those within the district boundaries. And that allows us to align with existing political and administrative boundaries and requirements, and to have a reliable demographic matching to those. And finally, we need electoral information. And this is something that the United States has a diverse range of approaches for. The demographic and geographic information in the US comes primarily from the United States Census. But the electoral statistics used in redistricting actually come from a variety of places. They come out of the election process, but they are not aggregated generally and linked to district level plans by the census or generally by states, but through other efforts. The election lab at University of Florida, the MIT election lab has done a lot of good work in gathering the election information that is published at the county and state level, aggregating it, matching it to census lines so that it can be used publicly in redistricting, for example. And election characteristics are needed because any of these measures of fairness, whether it's declination or partisanship or a number of competitive districts, or any other measure of fairness that you'd like to consider, is talking about, fundamentally about how that plan, that policy proposal as a map is likely to perform in counterfactual elections. And if you don't have a history of the counterfactual elections and the underlying composition demographics that supported those in the previous districts, you're not going to be able to predict counterfactually what the likely consequences of the lines will be. So you wouldn't be able to evaluate the fairness, nor to be able to compare those to historical baselines to see if these plans are unusual. So these are critical, and there are a number of qualities to data that are critical, particularly completeness, which is stated in terms of what you need to do to determine that a plan is legal, so that any member of the public, for example, can evaluate that the plan meets the minimum legal requirements in terms of population equality and of following the right boundaries, et cetera, and to predict the outcomes from that. And then it has to be timely. Data that comes very late in the process may not give enough time for public deliberation, as we've seen sometimes with delays in census data here. It has to be authentic. You need to be able to trace it back to legitimate sources. All data comes, especially demographic data, comes with some degree of uncertainty, so you need to be able to understand how accurate it is. It needs to be open so that the public can examine it, accurate, and it needs to be comparable. Often there's the election, especially in the US, electoral statistics and demographic characteristics are measured in different statistical units. So a big part of making reliable, authentic predictions is aligning these so that they are comparable. Because in the end, all of this, the demographic, the geographic boundaries, and the electoral statistics need to be put together in order to make a redistricting plan and understand how it works. As far as participation, both data and technology can be used to scaffold more meaningful participations in redistricting. And we've looked at this in a number of ways. Open and accessible data by itself, having the data available, supports information seeking, and it gives organized interest some more ability to participate in the process, to generate proposals. But with the addition of technology, you can support public commentary and deliberation. Professor Warshaw talked about PlanScore, which enables essentially anyone to evaluate any districting plan based on a whole range of measures. That's made possible in part by the data from the previous page and the effort by other academics like the University of Florida to collect and organize election data, make it comparable so that we can do these evaluations. And we also, colleagues and I have worked on open source software for creating districting plans. District Builder, which there's a point or two there, allows anyone to create a legal districting plan. And actually, there's a button to send it to PlanScore if you want more advanced analytics than the simple number of competitive seats and other number of predicted partisan seats that this provides. But open mapping tools support direct democratic engagement. They can be used to support consultative governments, to empower redistricting commissions to be more consultative in how they operate, and to support the discovery of community of interest. When you have hundreds of thousands of plans, you can start to see the lines where communities emerge in different proposals. And so that can be very different from trying a statistical picture and looking for sort of general patterns in rural areas, for example. So how does this come together? Data and technology, participant technology, come together to support trust, fairness, and representation in redistricting. Institutions that are independent and publicly accountable are the foundation for trust and fairness. Metrics by themselves, data by itself is not going to do it. If, as Professor Warshaw says, the parties themselves run the show, the institution, regardless, ends up dominated in partisan outcomes. But when we have more independent institutions that are publicly accountable, that enables the potential for more fairness. Accountability depends on processes that are transparent, consistent, and adjudicable. So having the data available, understandable, accessible, having those evaluation tools and participation tools that were illustrated is part of what makes that process, protects those processes and institutions. And having consistent processes and representative outcomes requires that the demographic data, again, are demographic, geographic, and electoral data are timely, authentic, honest, complete, accurate, comparable, and open. So, we've talked a next stage for this that we've developed tools for is the participative mapping tools like District Builder, and these can be used to reveal a broad range of viable boundaries, provide evidence for communities of interest. So all of these things, the data and the tools, can contribute to accountable institutions, transparency, and representative outcomes.
Wonderful, thank you. Professor Stephanopoulos, hearing about these principles and hearing about the needs, the tall order, right, to do this well, I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about the consequences of the delimitation decisions in recent elections, and also any new standards that have or are emerging or we might look to generate either here in the US or applicable elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm just sorry that I couldn't be there in person with you. I'd be happy to chat about redistricting court decisions. And let me just start out by saying that there are a lot of redistricting court decisions. In the current 2020s redistricting cycle alone, there are more than 200 lawsuits filed in more than 40 states. So the typical district map in America is litigated on at least some basis. Now let me go through various categories of claims that can be maintained in these cases. Let's go to the next slide. And I'll go through these claims in order by when they originated. So first off, we have one person, one vote claims. These are claims that there is impermissible or excessive malapportionment in the district map. So the population of districts varies too much. This claim originated back in the 1960s, as Professor Warshaw mentioned, with the so-called reapportionment revolution. It was a very big deal back then. These days, because the law is pretty clear on what level of population inequality or equality is permissible, we see relatively few claims of this kind, and even fewer succeeding. Then next, racial vote dilution claims refer to claims that minority voters in particular are underrepresented because of some aspect of the electoral system. So maybe lines are drawn in such a way that minority communities are systematically cracked or packed. Or maybe a locality uses winner-take-all at-large elections where the majority group is able to sweep every seat. And so as a constitutional matter, racial vote dilution claims were recognized back in the 1970s. More importantly today, most current vote dilution claims are brought under the Voting Rights Act. And these claims are very important today. Just last year, for example, the Supreme Court ruled that Alabama has to draw a second majority black district because its prior map with only one majority black district was diluting the influence of black voters in Alabama. And these claims are most likely to prevail when you have current underrepresentation of minority voters, and it's possible to draw additional reasonably configured districts where minority voters would be able to elect their preferred candidates. And also when there's a significantly polarized voting on the basis of race. And then further, when there's a particular history of racial discrimination in a jurisdiction. So there are a lot of these criteria, but they're often satisfied in different American jurisdictions, especially in the South. Then we have racial gerrymandering claims, which are often confused with racial vote dilution claims, but they actually cut in exactly the opposite way. So the thrust of a racial gerrymandering claim is that a district was drawn with race as the predominant motive, and there was insufficient justification for focusing so much on race in the redistricting process. So this claim is very much alive. Earlier today, the Supreme Court announced that it would hear a major racial gerrymandering case involving the second black majority district in Louisiana. But typically, this kind of claim is used to dismantle minority opportunity districts on the ground that they were drawn for predominantly racial reasons. And so this claim is very often in tension with the previous claim of racial vote dilution. And sometimes jurisdictions feel like they're stuck no matter what they do. If they don't draw an additional minority district, they might be liable for racial vote dilution. If they do draw that district, they might be liable for racial gerrymandering. Then we have partisan gerrymandering claims, which I'll talk in some more detail about when I get to my next slide. As Professor Warshaw mentioned, this is no longer a recognized claim under federal law, but it used to be until 2019. And partisan gerrymandering claims remain viable in many states where they're recognized under state constitutions rather than the federal constitution. And then finally, we have state law claims. So state constitutions include all kinds of criteria for redistricting. And whenever somebody thinks that some of these criteria may have been violated, they can go to court and argue that the non-compactness of a map is illegal, or that the district's failure to respect communities of interest is illegal, or the districts aren't sufficiently following county or municipal boundaries. Those are all common kinds of state law claims. In recent years, state constitutions and state laws have also been rising above the federal floor with respect to racial vote dilution and partisan gerrymandering. And so increasingly, there are state-level racial vote dilution claims and partisan gerrymandering claims being filed and succeeding around the country. Next slide. So I mentioned I would do a deep dive, or a very quick dive, into the partisan gerrymandering cause of action in particular. This is, in my view, the most potent of the available legal claims, and so it's worth understanding in a little bit more detail. So in 1986, the Supreme Court actually said that excessive partisan gerrymandering can violate the federal Constitution. However, the court set the bar for succeeding in a claim like this so high that not a single plaintiff ever was able to satisfy the court's original 1986 test. So then in a big 2004 decision, the court scrapped its original test for partisan gerrymandering, but very strangely, it didn't replace that test with anything else. And so for a while, plaintiffs and other parties were left in a weird sort of limbo where a claim technically existed, but there was no standard in place for determining whether a given map was valid or invalid. In the 2010s, plaintiffs and lawyers, including myself, began testing new theories and new metrics in federal court to fight partisan gerrymandering. In a bunch of states in the 2010s, we had smoking gun evidence of partisan intent when districts were drawn. We had evidence that, according to some of the metrics that Professor Warshaw discussed, plans in the last cycle were extraordinarily biased. And then computer simulations also showed that in many of these states, you would never or almost never get such a large bias if you drew district lines without considering election results. And so federal courts were open to this kind of evidence, and they began ruling in favor of plaintiffs in Wisconsin and North Carolina and other states. But then in 2019, in the Common Cause v. Warshaw decision, the Supreme Court slammed the door on this kind of litigation and held that partisan gerrymandering claims are categorically non-justiciable beyond the power of the federal courts to address. And so that didn't end partisan gerrymandering litigation. It just shifted it to state court, which is where it's taken place this cycle. And so this cycle, litigants have continued to rely on the same kinds of evidence and the same kinds of legal theories that federal courts recognized in the previous cycle. And they've had a good deal of success in some states. So courts struck down Democratic gerrymanders in Maryland and New York. And courts also struck down Republican gerrymanders in North Carolina and Ohio. And a bunch of other partisan gerrymandering cases in other states have also been litigated. So this is an area where, despite the best efforts of the US Supreme Court, litigation over the partisan motives and partisan effects of district plans continues to rage across the country. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. We have a number of good questions in the chat. We have a few minutes left, so we'll get to just a few of them. I wonder if any of the three of you, or perhaps all three of you, could speak to what broader inclusion, say, of young people, of women, of persons with disabilities in the process of delimitation, in the boundary drawing exercise, what impacts you see that potentially having on the outcomes? Anybody, feel free.
Well, I can throw out a little bit of anecdotes, which is that when we first started looking at publicly generated plans that were submitted by people or organizations in the US, we looked at 2,000, there were maybe 10, 20 that we could identify. When we were able to leverage open data and open technology to build things like District Builder, and Dave's redistricting app was another piece of software that came out around that time. We started to see thousands of people, and we were submitting legal plans. We were able to run competitions in colleges and in high schools, so that we had 12-year-olds drawing a legal district that would beat the partisan score of the party proposed districts in their state. And in this last round, there were hundreds of thousands of public maps drawn and we don't have demographics on it, but it's clearly expanded the ability for people to participate, even people who are not able to come physically, who might be younger or older, et cetera.
I can add quickly that I totally agree with respect to participation and drawing district lines. People sometimes wonder, why do we focus so much on racial and partisan gerrymandering? Why don't we also talk much, if ever, about gender gerrymandering, age-based gerrymandering, disability-based gerrymandering? And there's kind of a good conceptual answer, which is that in a system of single-member winner-take-all districts, district lines only really matter for groups that, one, are geographically concentrated enough that they could potentially control the outcome in certain districts, and two, groups that are internally cohesive. They usually favor the same candidates, but yet are opposed by other groups that are themselves cohesive in supporting other candidates. And so those criteria clearly apply to racial and partisan groups. They don't really apply to groups defined by gender or age or disability, because those groups usually aren't geographically concentrated enough. And also, those aren't sufficient cleavages in our political system. So, if you told a district drawer, please try to gerrymander against children, please try to gerrymander against the disabled, they would have no real ability to do so, just because those aren't the relevant kinds of axes in our districting system. So that's why when it comes to litigation and criteria, you don't hear much about these other kinds of axes.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Maybe then just to sum up with our last 2 minutes here, we had a panel earlier this morning about trust. And I wonder how the outcomes, the process of drawing these boundaries, the impact that has had on trust from your perspectives, and how, again, this open data, we can balance the accessible information with the increased need for building trust and electoral integrity.
Well, I think that at least in the recent, my personal perspective, recent political experience, that trust is more about institutions than the accuracy of the redistricting data. There has been some, there have been debates over that, but that the trustworthiness of the outcomes and whether the game is fixed has to do with the fairness that is a result of a particular institutional structure. So, as I pointed out earlier, the root of trust is in having independent institutions that are accountable and that are accountable to the public, and open data, transparency, et cetera. They are in support of that. So that's, redistricting in the U.S., often that stage is lacking.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, I think that clearly politicians are going to draw, if they have the power to draw maps, they're going to draw maps that are skewed in favor of their side's interests. And no amount of public hearings or other transparency is going to totally take away that self-interest. So I think that the recent moves to shift the redistricting institutions from politicians to nonpartisan independent commissions and other actors is far and away the most important reform in recent years. And it's led across the country to more fair maps in places that had some of the most gerrymandered maps in recent decades, now have some of the most fair maps. So I think this has just been a really significant reform. And if we've learned from this experience is that the more you can establish these independent processes, that increases trust in the process, it leads to more fair maps, and I think it puts our democracy on a more firm ground.
Well said.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Professor Warshaw, Professor Stephanopoulos, for joining us virtually. Thank you so much, Dr. Altman, for joining me here on stage. And thank you, everyone, for your attention. We will now have a brief coffee break, and then on to our next session, which is Access for All. It's an interactive simulation, which will take place in Salon 10. And we'll be back in this room after that, starting at 3:15 for our next panel. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.